Alright, hello once again. This is Jeff Scott of Rankin Technical College, and I've been going over the PowerPoint presentations for Web Development and Design Foundations with HTML5, 8th edition by Terry Felke-Morris. Two things I wanted to mention before we get started. First, you may notice that the appearance that I have here with the black background, etc., I'm not going to have that for every one of the presentations, for whatever reason. When I'm here at Rankin and I bring this up in PowerPoint, it looks like this. And when I have it in, when I'm doing it from my apartment, it shows basically just the slides. So it's going to look a little different. That's the first thing. The second thing is, as I create these projects, what I end up doing when I get done, I create them in some software called Camtasia. And it's a screenshot software type of thing, and when I get done, I produce them. So you can see Chapter 6, which we just went over, is being produced right now. So when I'm making a presentation and you see something that comes up here and it looks a little bit funky, for lack of better words, so my screen goes and you see all this stuff that comes up, what's happened is what I just finished doing, the production has finished. So what I do is I take that production file that you see on screen and I remove the audio and I remove the video from it because it's already been saved into a folder. All right, so if you see that, I just didn't want you to get freaked out or anything with it. All right, so Chapter 7. We've got about 10 objectives. Code relative hyperlinks to web pages and folders within a website. You probably have seen this. A real popular thing to do here is to have something where it basically says down near the bottom of the page, or maybe in different intervals on the page, you've got a link that says top. And if you click it, you go back up to the top of the page. Configure a hyperlink to a named fragment internal to a web page. These all work together. Provide for accessibility by using ARIA landmark roles for structural elements. So again, we're going to go back and talk more about accessibility. Configure images with CSS sprites. Configure a 3-column page layout using CSS. We looked at 2-column in the last chapter. Now it's 3-column. Configure CSS for printing. Start to think about, if you were going to print something out, what wouldn't you want to print? For instance, and I just want to show you this. I'm deviating a little bit here. But if I come out here and as an example, if I go out here to Rankin's website, rankin.edu. All right, you see we got a lot of full motion video that'll be coming up in here, etc. If I go to print this out, all right, what you'll notice is, personally, I wouldn't have probably set it up like this, but it's showing at least some of the video. Do I want that? Well, quite often, if you are going to print something out, your CSS for printing will do things like remove all color. Why? Because if you're going to print something out in color, it's going to really drain the color ink that you have in the cartridge. You might want to remove all images. All right. There might be things in here like taglines that don't really make any sense. You might want to remove those. So there's a lot of different things that you can do to make it easier when you start printing. Talk about some of those in this chapter. All right. Continuing on. Describe mobile design best practices. We talked mobile a couple chapters ago. It'll be kind of a point that gets discussed throughout. Configure web pages for mobile display using what's called the viewport meta tag, and we'll talk about what that means. Finally, apply responsive web design techniques with CSS3 media queries. Let's check something here, because I don't know what I'm about to show you. Okay? All right. I'm going to take this website and I'm going to keep making it smaller and smaller and smaller. And you'll notice when I get to a certain page, or to a certain width, I should say, notice how all of our menu items go away. See that? And now we've got this. We click this, there's the menu items. All right? That's what's known as responsive web design. The idea is that even as something gets smaller, you're able to still work with it, view it, etc. Now this is done very well, just taking a quick look at it. All right? And as I go down to a certain, again, even when I make it real small, like a small cell phone, that looks pretty darn good. So they've done a nice job here at Rankin as far as setting that up. All right. So more on relative linking. Relative links from the home page. So if you've got a website, it's definitely much easier to link to your own page than it is to link to a website on someone else's page. Typically, if you're going to link to a website on someone else's page, you can only link to the top of the page. All right? You can use things called fragment identifiers. All right, so I'm going to do this. I'm going to come in and grab this div that we saw in here, right there. All right, and I'm going to have an ID equal top, and what we'll do is for that div, we'll set that up right at the top of our document here. So div ID equal top. And we'll just have a closing div tag. Nothing else there. All right, so there's an ID equal top. Then we'll come through here and we'll say this. I'm only going to put in like one of these. I'm going to go down to the very bottom of my document. All right, so down near the very bottom, let's do it right before this thing about the border and the radius property. So we'll do it right before that. So I'll paste it in. All right, so you see what I've done. Let's run it and see if it works, and then go back and look at it. All right, so let's refresh the page. Doesn't look any different, except when I get down to the bottom here, back to top, and boom, there I go. So how did that work? You know, what was the magic that made that happen? Well, the first bit of magic was right here. I defined an area at the top of my page that was called top. You don't have to call it top. You can call it whatever you want. Doesn't necessarily have to be a div, but that's right. This is just an empty area in the document. And then down here, what I said was, oh, I put in a hypertext reference, but it said instead of going to another page, it said go to the page I'm on and go to the area that's identified by an ID of top. And the underline, stuff that's underlined should say back to top. So this says ID of top, and where did we get that from? ID of top. All right. So that's linking to what's referred to as a fragment identifier. You quite often see these on web pages, especially pages where you've got maybe even a single page app where everything is on one page and it just scrolls down and down and down, where you might have a way to jump back up on a page. All right. Accessible Rich Internet Applications, ARIA. Landmark roles. Well, notice that there are some names in here that appear at least to make sense. In other words, banner is used for a header or logo area. Navigation, if you're going to have some kind of a nav bar or whatever. Main for your main content. Complementary, which is basically, which supports the main stuff. Content info, form, and search. So if you put in these types of tags and you put in the roles, what that's doing is it's sending a message if your web page is going to be spidered, and we'll talk about what that means in a later chapter, by a search engine, it'll know what certain things mean. All right, opening a link in a new browser window. Now this is a quite important, an important topic. So let's take a second to talk about it. I'm going to copy this, and I'm going to put in this link. So I'm going to come in and right where we were before. All right, we'll put it right before this. We'll put it right here. All right, so I've got href equals Yahoo, target equal blank, Yahoo. Pretty obvious what that does, but we'll run it anyway just so you can see it. Let's refresh. Go down to the bottom. It'll be the Yahoo. There it is. We click, and boom. It opens up Yahoo. Good. All right. The key part of this is there's our window, and there's Yahoo. It opened it up in a new window. If you ever open up another website from within your website, you should always open it up, and you should always say, as we had here, target equal blank, which means open it in a new window. And the reason that you should do that is if you don't, if you open it in the same window you're in, people might mistakenly think that whatever window is open is part of your site when it's not. It's considered bad netiquette. You've heard of etiquette before. Netiquette is your etiquette on the web. So it's considered bad etiquette to do that. HTML block anchor. Configure block display elements within a hyperlink. All right. So, again, I'm not sure exactly why they're showing this, but we're going to grab it anyway. Again, I think this, and hopefully you're agreeing with me, this is the best way to learn this stuff, is to just take it, open up a page, and keep adding things to your page. All right. Line break tag there. In fact, a couple of them. All right, and a couple more here. And we'll paste that in. All right. So what we're saying is what we want to have highlighted here in our A tag should be all of this stuff. And let's see if that works and what it looks like. So again, I can now take that Yahoo and close it, refresh my page. And notice all of that is highlighted. It's a block of stuff. And if I click on anything here, there, it doesn't matter. It's going to open up the HTML markup session, or section, I should say. Telephone and text hyperlinks. Kind of an important one right here. All right, you probably have seen this before. I know I have, that if you go out to a certain website, they may ask you when you bring something like this up, they may ask you if you want to make a phone call. You know, they'll show you a number and they'll say, do you want to give, place a call to that number? All right, so let's look at this. Again, always refresh, and there it is. All right. Open pick for app. It says, remember this, open pick an app. And it'll ask you how you want to open it. The point is this. This right here is basically saying what you want to do is you want to attempt to place a call to that number. All right. Not supported by every browser, but it is a way, as it says right here, many mobile browsers will initiate a phone call. Well, I'm not mobile right now. I can't place, I'm using a laptop, and I don't think I have the software on it, so I can place a phone call from this. You can either place a phone call or a text. Sprites we talked about a little bit earlier. You may or may not remember. A sprite, as mentioned there, is an image file that contains a bunch of small graphics. The advantage is twofold. First, it saves download time. Second, it provides kind of a container for multiple images. All right. We talked in the last chapter. We saw first we saw the one column layout where everything was just basically we had a row here for header, a row here for nav, a row here for main, and a row here for footer. Then we went to a two column layout where we looked at that in two ways, where the nav either, we had a header, and then at the bottom we had a footer that ran the whole way, a nav over here, and a main. Or we had the nav that ran the whole gamut, and then the header, then the footer, and then the main. Now we're talking about a three-column layout, where we've got the nav bar here, and we've got an aside over here. Now it doesn't necessarily have to be the nav bar on the left like that. There could be an aside here, and an aside there. We looked at an example a lot earlier in our PowerPoints. I think it was a thing from Sedona out in Arizona, and I believe there we had a three-column format. So as mentioned, a common web page layout consists of a header across the top of the page and three columns below. This may or may not be navigation. This is our content area, and this is an aside. Again, this could be just really, in this case, all the navigation area is it's another aside. So when we do that, we're going to end up floating. So we're going to float the navigation to the left. We're going to float the aside to the right, and we're not going to basically do any floating on our main area. As it says, the container sets the default background color, the text color, the font, etc. And we can do whatever we want to or need to with that. So they show you a left column navigation, a right, a center. Remember, for the footer, you want to make sure, as it says, it does a clear both. So it clears any float left and it clears any float right rather. All right, styling for print I mentioned to you before. Typically you'll have two of these, and you'll notice that the first one says media equals screen, which is the default value. But if you're going to have two different CSS files, it's kind of nice that they have the same name, but one says print on the end, like they show here, and for that one it should say media equal print. Again, the things that you should be worried about are things I mentioned to you before. Hide any non-essential content by using display none. Configure font sizes and font colors for printing. Probably you want background colors to be white. You want font colors to be black. Control page breaks, so you have some kind of control over where things actually do break. Do you want to print URLs for hyperlinks? You may not want to. All right, now let's go back into the world of mobile. Remember the limitations that you have with mobile, and it's interesting to me, one of the biggest ones they don't even, I guess they do show it down here, but they say mobile, smaller screen size, lower bandwidth, limited font availability, limited color availability. If you go nuts with color on a phone, you're probably going to lose your message. Controls may be awkward. Lack of flash support. Flash is important. It's basically a way that you can run video and do other stuff. And Flash is, by and large, totally non-supported in Apple products. And the demise of Flash is one of the things that led to the reintroduction of HTML with HTML5. Limited processor and memory. Remember, typically it's running off of a battery. It's not going to be as powerful a machine as a laptop or a desktop or even a tablet typically. And there's typically a cost that's going to be involved. Anybody who's ever overrun on your data knows what I'm talking about. The W3C, the World Wide Web Consortium, has their own mobile web design best practices, and you can go to a couple of those URLs there if you'd like. Notice optimized layout, navigation graphics, and text for mobile use designed for OneWeb. The design for OneWeb with a lot of it is you start, again, we talked about this, with a mobile first mentality. So when you're developing a new site, you develop it to look good on a mobile device first and you work your way up. So it should look best when you start, it should work and look good on a mobile phone. Even the smallest mobile phone that might ever use it. Probably not a flip phone anymore, virtually no one has those. But some of the older Android phones and some of the older iPhones, etc., are fairly narrow. All right. Then you work your way up to a tablet. Then you work your way up to a laptop. Then you work your way up to a desktop. Then you work your way up to even bigger devices. So, when you're worried about working with mobile, typically single column design. I showed you that before with the Rankin site. Limit scrolling to one direction, up and down. Typically you don't allow a scroll from left to right. Use heading elements, but use them sparingly, so use them as needed. Use lists as needed. Avoid using tables. All right, this is pretty good here what they show. Provide labels for form controls. Avoid using pixel units in style sheets. This is important. You should avoid using pixels, px, and points, pt. All right, because pixels and points are fixed in size. Instead, you should use percentages or ems, because those are proportional in size. Use absolute positioning in style sheets. Hide content, that might be the most important one. Hide any content that's not essential for mobile use. You might have a real cool picture, but you know what? It doesn't do diddly for a phone. Provide minimal navigation near the top of the page and make sure it's consistent. Avoid hyperlinks that open files in new windows or have pop-ups. Try to balance the number of hyperlinks on the page and the number of levels needed to access information. Still, the 3-click rule does apply. Ideally, the person can get anywhere they want to get in a website in 3 clicks or less. Avoid displaying images that are wider than the screen width. I would take it to avoid displaying images unless they're really necessary. Configure alternate optimized background images. Some mobile browsers will downsize all images, so avoid images that contain text because you might totally lose it. Avoid the use of large graphic images. Specify the size of images. Provide alternative text for graphics and other non-text elements. So again, the idea is make limited use at best of images and avoid the use of images whenever possible. Configure good contrast, even more important than on a desktop or laptop. Contrast between the text color and the background colors. Use common font typefaces. This isn't the time for some screwy font on a phone because it just may be very hard, if not impossible, to read. Again, configure font sizes with M units or percentages, as I mentioned. Use short descriptive page titles. Now, as we start to go into this, what you'll see, as you can see right here, is this viewport meta tag. It says the default action for most mobile devices is to zoom out and scale the web page. This was originally created as an Apple extension, but virtually everyone uses it now. Viewport is the name. The width, you're saying make it as wide as whatever medium I'm using, and the initial scale equals 1.0, which means when you bring it up, make it 100%. There's more things you can add on here. Sometimes you see it set up so that basically the zoom is disabled. All right, so you'll see some more of that as you go on and you work with this. So how do you do this? You know, what I showed you before when we were looking in here, and I showed you the Rankin website, not mine. Mine, if you notice, is totally non-responsive. See that? It doesn't change. But the Rankin one, as we saw, as we hit certain points in a size, things appear or disappear. So notice we now have all of the things there for our menu. But when we reach a certain point, it disappears. And it goes over here. It's still there. All right. And when we reach a certain point, notice we still have the logo here, but sometimes you even want this stuff to go away. The only thing I'd mention here is they probably should have made this 60K a little bit smaller, change the font size once you got to that point. Well, the point is, no pun intended there, what we're talking about here is what we're saying to do this, you can use what are called media queries. And what that says, for example right here, when you reach a max width of 768 pixels, all right, so everywhere between the smallest number of pixels you have and 768, do whatever is in between these curly braces. So as it says, a media query determines the capability of the mobile device, things like screen resolution. Directs the browser to do those styles that are inside there when you have that type of situation. So notice the difference between this. This was that Sedona thing that we looked at before. All right. So once we're on the browser, we've got the three-column image, and I guess they do have a nav over here, and a side, and here's our content area. When you reach tablet width, now instead of this being along the side and it being 3-column, it now goes to 2-column, and the nav goes on top. And when you reach a certain point for a smartphone, it's now 1-column. All right. So notice, image, max width 100%. That's an important one. That tells you to try to scale your images. Okay, we can try that. I don't know if that's going to do much of anything or not, but we'll try it. Let's copy that. And this will have to go into our CSS file. And what we're telling it here is try to display the image at 100% and have its height not change. Is this going to change anything? We're going to find out. So I'm back to here. I want to go back to my website and I want to refresh. Now I do want to change size. All right. And you see the size, in this case, that size isn't changing. Does not appear to have it's making any difference on what I'm doing here. We're going to, again, you're going to see certain themes in this text that we're going to go over again and again and again in certain points. All right? So, flexible images. There's a picture element that you have, okay? This is kind of neat. What this is saying is you'd need to have 3 different images. And this would be the size you'd have maybe for a desktop, or probably. This would be the size that you would have for a tablet. And this would be the size that you would have for a phone. So you'd have 3 different picture sizes. That's oftentimes better than trying to scale for the medium that you're currently using. All right. Testing mobile display options. Really important one. There are emulators that you can use. So I can actually, what I've been showing you is I've been coming in here and saying things like, okay, so if I wanted to make this the size of a phone, I can do it like this. There are emulators that are built into virtually every browser. Chrome mobile emulator. All right. Use Chrome's DevTools device mode to build. This is just the way you do it in Chrome. Okay. So you come up here and you can toggle the device that you're using. So what you can do, the reason that that's important I believe that's up here someplace. All right. The reason that that's important is when you're running different pages, you can emulate them appearing on devices of different sizes rather than you constantly moving this around. It's much more, than I'm making it sound like, and it's a very important concept because you want to always test a website on every device you can think of, every browser type you can think of, on every device you can think of, and as many versions as you possibly can. All right. Something fairly new in here is something that's called Flexbox. As it says, Flexbox is a great way to easily configure multi-column page layouts. Elements contained within this flexible container can be configured horizontally or vertically. It says it's not well supported by browsers. It depends on the browser. This brings up two things. First, very neat website. Should have mentioned it earlier, but I have not, and that is caniuse.com. And what it does is it has different, so I can say a list of features, okay? So I can say, for example, Flexbox, and it'll show me which browsers support Flexbox and which don't, and which versions of those browsers support it and which don't. Now that's kind of neat. If you want to know more about Flexbox, and I think we'll talk about it in a later chapter, there's an article on a site that's called CSStricks.com. And that's it there, a complete guide to Flexbox. This is a great place to start if you want to learn about Flexbox. So I just want to show you the URL here. Make it as big as I possibly can, and I'll leave it up there for a moment. And that's too big. That's fine. So if you go out to https://css-tricks.com/snippets/a-guide-to-flexbox, it's a great beginning. This is by no means the only reference there is on Flexbox. In fact, if I type in Flexbox W3C, for example, there is W3 Schools, Flexbox. That's another great place to go to start learning about it. Talks about browser support and the like. And I can even go to the W3C site, the World Wide Web Consortium, to find out more about Flexbox. It's a fairly new way of doing things. But it's a fairly new way of doing things and a fairly more common way of doing things. It says you're configuring a flexible container. You've got a little bit more leeway with what you do and how you do it. All right? Okay, we talked about this in the last chapter as far as debugging. Start by manually trying to check for your errors, then go to the validator. As necessary, use divs to provide temporary background colors for different areas and/or temporary borders. Use comments to comment things in, comment things out. The time to write comments is when you're creating something. It's not that, don't say I'm going to go back and write comments later. You typically will not. Again, don't expect your pages to look exactly the same in all browsers. Don't expect your pages to look exactly the same on all different types of media. And again, be patient. So that's it. So in this chapter, we talked about relative hyperlinks. You saw how to use those name fragments, and I did the back to top. We looked at accessibility very quickly and the ARIA standards. This is what I mentioned before. This is the last one I was working on. So I can now remove my sound file, and I can remove that from the clip bin. There we go. All right. We talked a little bit about sprites. This is maybe the third chapter where we've looked at sprites a little bit. We talked about a 3-column layout, whereas in the last chapter we started with a 1-column and went to a 2-column. We talked about how you want to set up some of your CSS for printing. Then the rest of the chapter was basically concerned with mobile. Mobile best practices, how to configure for mobile using things like viewport tags and media queries. And we ended by, again, looking at some responsive web design techniques. So that's it for Chapter 7. When I return, it will be for Chapter 8. And Chapter 8, which in your book starts on page 370, is a short chapter. It's on tables. And what I'll do is we'll go over, of course, all the stuff, and I'll build a fairly simplistic table for you. All right, it's a fairly short chapter in the book. After that, we go into Chapter 9, which is on forms, and in much the same way, I'll build you a form on this page that we have. All right, and probably the last one I'll do today will be Chapter 10, which again talks about the HTML development process. It's a short chapter, and it's more of the same as far as giving you some best practices and talk about some generalities of website development. So that's what we've got coming up next, and I'll be back with that shortly.